The young snipers kept missing repeatedly, until a veteran woman took the rifle in her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground at Fort Benning, Georgia. Dust particles danced in the air as 23 young soldiers lined up behind their rifles, sweat already beading on their foreheads despite the early hour. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of helicopters and the occasional bark of a drill sergeant somewhere across the base. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez wiped his brow as he watched his newest batch of sniper trainees. 3 weeks into their training, and the results were nothing short of disastrous. These kids couldn't hit the broad side of a barn, let alone a target at 800 meters. His frustration was mounting with each passing day, and he could see the doubt creeping into the young soldier's eyes. Among the trainees was Private Jake Thompson, a 19-year-old from rural Montana who had grown up hunting with his father. Back home, he could drop a deer at 300 yards without breaking a sweat. But here, surrounded by military protocol and high-tech equipment, he couldn't seem to find his mark. His confidence was shattered, and each missed shot felt like a personal failure. Next to Jake stood Private Maria Santos from East Los Angeles. She had joined the Army to escape the violence of her neighborhood, hoping to find purpose and direction. She had never held a rifle before basic training, but her steady hands and keen eyesight had impressed her instructors enough to recommend her for sniper school. Now, 3 weeks in, she was beginning to wonder if they had made a mistake. Private David Kim from Seattle was the third member of what the other trainees had started calling the Miss Club. A former computer programmer who had enlisted after feeling disconnected from civilian life, David approached everything with analytical precision. He had studied ballistics, wind patterns, and shooting techniques until he could recite them in his sleep. Yet when it came time to pull the trigger, something always went wrong. The three had become unlikely friends, bonded by their shared struggles and the whispered doubts of their fellow trainees. They spent their evenings in the barracks, poring over manuals and discussing techniques, determined to prove themselves worthy of the sniper badge they all desperately wanted to earn. Sergeant Rodriguez had been a sniper instructor for 8 years, and he had seen all kinds of recruits come through his program. Some were natural marksmen who seemed to have been born with a rifle in their hands. Others struggled initially but found their rhythm through dedication and practice. But this group was different. They had the fundamentals down, their equipment was properly zeroed, and their understanding of the science behind long-range shooting was solid. Yet when it mattered most, when the pressure was on and the target was in their sights, they consistently missed. The training facility itself was state-of-the-art, featuring multiple ranges with targets at various distances. The longest range stretched out to 1,200 meters, winding through natural terrain that included hills, valleys, and patches of dense forest. It was designed to simulate real combat conditions, complete with wind flags, environmental challenges, and time pressures that would test even experienced marksmen. On this particular morning, Rodriguez had planned another qualification attempt. The trainees would have 3 shots each at targets positioned at 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. To pass this phase of training, they needed to achieve at least 2 hits out of 3 at each distance. It sounded simple enough, but for Jake, Maria, and David, it had become an insurmountable challenge. Jake settled into his shooting position, adjusting his bipod legs and checking his scope settings for the 100th time. His breathing was controlled, his grip consistent, and his natural point of aim felt perfect. The target at 600 meters looked clear through his scope, and he had accounted for the gentle crosswind blowing from left to right. He took a deep breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with familiar recoil, and he quickly cycled the bolt to chamber another round. Through his scope, he could see the target clearly, but there was no hole where there should have been one. Another miss. His spotter, a more experienced trainee named Collins, shook his head sympathetically. Maria was next. She had spent extra time in the gym working on her upper body strength, knowing that controlling the heavy rifle was crucial for accurate shooting. Her form was textbook perfect as she aligned her shot. The mathematics of ballistics ran through her mind like a checklist. Range, wind speed, temperature, humidity. Everything pointed to a successful shot. She controlled her breathing just as she had been taught and fired. The result was the same, another miss. David's analytical mind was racing as he prepared for his turn. He had calculated every variable he could think of, cross-referenced his data with environmental conditions, and even factored in the Coriolis effect. His laptop back in the barracks was filled with spreadsheets tracking his practice sessions, noting every detail that might explain his consistent failures. He took his position with mechanical precision, his movements economical and practiced. The target seemed to mock him through the scope as he made his final adjustments. This time had to be different. This time, all his preparation and analysis would pay off. He fired with complete confidence in his calculations. The miss was as clean as the others. Rodriguez watched the proceedings with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. He had checked their rifles personally, ensuring they were properly zeroed and functioning correctly. He had reviewed their shooting positions, breathing techniques, and trigger control. By all accounts, these 3 soldiers should be hitting their targets consistently. Their knowledge was solid, their equipment was perfect, and their dedication was unquestionable. After the morning's failed qualification attempt, Rodriguez called the 3 aside for a private conversation. They gathered in a small classroom adjacent to the range, the air thick with disappointment and frustration. Charts showing bullet trajectories and wind charts covered the walls, serving as constant reminders of the science they understood but couldn't seem to apply successfully. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Rodriguez began, his voice carrying both authority and genuine concern. "I've seen hundreds of soldiers come through this program. Some succeed quickly, others take more time, but everyone who has the fundamentals down the way you 3 do should be hitting these targets." Jake stared at his hands, calloused from years of farm work and now rough from military training. "Sergeant, I don't understand what we're doing wrong. Back home, I could hunt deer at distances longer than what we're shooting here. But put me behind one of these military rifles and I can't hit anything." Maria nodded in agreement. "I've studied every manual, practiced every technique. My shooting positions are solid. My breathing is controlled. I know I'm doing everything right, but the targets might as well be invisible for all the good it does me." David pulled out a small notebook filled with meticulous handwriting. "I've tracked every variable I can think of. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction, even the time of day. I've calculated the ballistic coefficients and trajectory paths. The math says I should be hitting center mass every time, but reality doesn't match the equations." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying the 3 young soldiers. There was something about their situation that reminded him of his own early struggles with long-range shooting. He had been fortunate to have a mentor who had helped him break through his initial challenges, but these 3 seemed to be facing something different, something he couldn't quite identify. The afternoon brought another round of training, this time focusing on field shooting positions and quick target engagement. The trainees would have to identify and engage multiple targets at varying ranges within time limits, simulating the pressure of combat situations. It was an exercise that required not just accuracy, but speed and decision-making under stress. Jake, Maria, and David approached the exercise with determination, hoping that a change in format might somehow break their streak of failures. They had spent their lunch break discussing strategies and encouraging each other, building the kind of camaraderie that often develops between soldiers facing shared challenges. The course began with a sprint to the first firing position, where trainees had to quickly identify a target at 400 meters and engage within 30 seconds. Jake reached his position first, dropped into a prone stance, and acquired his target through the scope. The silhouette was clear and well-defined against the backdrop of the hills. He fired quickly, knowing that speed was as important as accuracy in this exercise. Miss Maria arrived at her position seconds later, her heart pounding from the sprint and the pressure of the time limit. She forced herself to slow her breathing, knowing that panic would only make things worse. The target was clearly visible through her scope, and she had plenty of time remaining. She fired with confidence. Miss. David's analytical approach served him well in quickly calculating range and wind conditions, but as his crosshairs settled on the target, doubt crept into his mind. The pattern of failures was becoming psychological as much as physical. He fired anyway, hoping that this time would be different. Miss. The exercise continued through multiple positions and targets, each requiring different skills and presenting unique challenges. There were targets partially concealed behind cover, requiring precise shot placement. Others were positioned at extreme angles, testing the trainee's ability to compensate for gravity and wind at unusual trajectories. Some targets appeared only briefly, demanding quick target acquisition and immediate engagement. For most of the trainees, the exercise was challenging but manageable. They scored hits on roughly 70% of their targets, which was considered acceptable for their level of training. But Jake, Maria, and David continued their streak of misses, their confidence eroding with each failed shot. By the end of the day, word had spread among the other trainees and instructors about the three soldiers who couldn't seem to hit anything. Some offered encouragement and advice, while others began to whisper about whether they belonged in the program at all. The psychological pressure was mounting, adding another layer of difficulty to an already challenging situation. That evening in the barracks, the three sat on Jake's bunk, sharing their frustrations and fears. The other trainees had gone to the recreation room to watch television or write letters home, leaving them alone with their doubts and disappointment. "Maybe we're overthinking this," Maria suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we're so focused on being perfect that we're psyching ourselves out." Jake shook his head. "I've been shooting since I was 12 years old. My dad always said that shooting was like riding a bike. Once you learn, you never forget. But here, it's like I've never held a rifle before in my life." David looked up from his notebook, where he had been recording the day's failures for later analysis. "I keep thinking there must be some variable I'm missing, some calculation I'm getting wrong. But I've checked and double-checked everything. The science is sound, but the results don't match." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on the barracks floor. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the end of Jake's bunk, his expressions serious but not unkind. In his 8 years as an instructor, he had learned to read the signs of soldiers who were struggling not just with skill development, but with confidence and self-doubt. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, settling onto a nearby footlocker. "Tomorrow I want to try something different. There's someone I want you to meet. Someone who might be able to help you figure out what's going wrong." The three trainees looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. They had tried everything they could think of, studied every manual, and practiced until their shoulders were sore from rifle recoil. The idea that someone else might have insights they had missed was both encouraging and humbling. "Who is it?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks of failure and frustration. Rodriguez smiled slightly, the first genuine smile the three had seen from him in days. "Her name is Elena Vasquez. She's a civilian contractor who comes in to help with special training situations. She has a unique perspective on marksmanship that might be exactly what you need." The mention of a woman instructor caused the three to exchange glances. In their experience, all their firearms training had been conducted by male instructors, most of them career military with combat experience. The idea of learning from a civilian, and a female civilian at that, was unexpected. "Is she former military?" Maria asked, her curiosity evident in her voice. "Not exactly," Rodriguez replied cryptically. "Elena has a background that's quite different from most instructors you'll encounter. But I can tell you this: She has helped soldiers in situations similar to yours, and her methods are unconventional but effective." As Rodriguez stood to leave, he paused and looked back at the three struggling trainees. "Get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow we're going to approach this problem from a completely different angle. Sometimes the solution to a complex problem is simpler than you think." After the sergeant left, Jake, Maria, and David sat in contemplative silence. The barracks around them hummed with the quiet activities of soldiers winding down from another day of training. Some were cleaning weapons, others were studying manuals, and a few were writing letters home to family and friends. The three friends had become accustomed to spending their evenings analyzing their failures and planning new approaches for the following day. But tonight felt different. The promise of meeting this mysterious instructor had given them their first real hope in weeks that their situation might improve. "What do you think she'll be like?" Maria wondered aloud, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. Jake shrugged, his mind wandering back to the women in his life who had influenced his relationship with firearms. His mother had been a competitive shooter in college, and his sister had won several local hunting competitions. "I don't know, but if Sergeant Rodriguez thinks she can help us, I'm willing to try anything." David closed his notebook and slipped it into his footlocker. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't planning to spend the evening calculating wind speeds and bullet trajectories. Maybe fresh eyes and a different perspective are exactly what we need. Sometimes when you're too close to a problem, you can't see the obvious solution. As the lights in the barracks dimmed and the three prepared for sleep, each carried their own mixture of hope and anxiety about the coming day. 3 weeks of consistent failure had tested their confidence and their commitment to becoming snipers, but the promise of help from this Elena Vasquez had rekindled their determination. Jake lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his father's words about shooting being like riding a bike. Maybe the problem wasn't that he had forgotten how to shoot, but that he was trying to ride a completely different kind of bike. Military precision shooting was a world away from hunting deer in the Montana wilderness, and perhaps he needed to learn an entirely new set of skills rather than trying to adapt his old ones. Maria's thoughts drifted to her motivation for joining the sniper program in the first place. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she had seen too much senseless violence, too many lives cut short by bullets fired without purpose or precision. She had been drawn to the idea of using marksmanship as a tool for protection rather than destruction, of being the kind of soldier who could make a difference in dangerous situations. The irony that she couldn't hit a stationary target wasn't lost on her. David's analytical mind continued working even as he tried to sleep, cycling through possibilities for what this Elena Vasquez might teach them. His background in computer programming had taught him that sometimes the most elegant solutions were also the simplest ones, and that complex problems often had surprisingly straightforward answers. Maybe their shooting problems fell into that category. The night passed slowly for all three, filled with restless sleep and dreams of missed shots and failed qualifications. But underlying their anxiety was a thread of anticipation that hadn't been there in weeks. Tomorrow would bring something new, something different, and perhaps something that would finally unlock the mystery of their persistent failures. As dawn approached and the familiar sounds of reveille echoed across the base, Jake, Maria, and David prepared for another day of training with renewed hope. They had no idea what Elena Vasquez would teach them or how her methods would differ from the conventional instruction they had received. But for the first time since arriving at sniper school, they felt like their situation might be about to change. The morning sun rose over Fort Benning just as it had every day for the past 3 weeks. But for 3 struggling young soldiers, it felt like the dawn of a new possibility. They dressed quickly, cleaned their weapons with extra care, and prepared to meet the woman who might hold the key to their success as snipers. Rodriguez had promised them that Elena's approach was unconventional, and that her background was different from any instructor they had encountered. As they made their way to the training range, all three wondered what kind of person could help them overcome 3 weeks of consistent failure. They were about to find out that sometimes the best teachers come from the most unexpected places, and that wisdom about marksmanship can be found in experiences far removed from military training. Elena Vasquez arrived at the training range in a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. She stepped out wearing simple civilian clothes, practical boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her weathered face from the Georgia sun. At 55, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft, though that craft was far from what the young soldiers might have expected. Jake, Maria, and David watched from a distance as she spoke quietly with Sergeant Rodriguez, gesturing occasionally toward the targets downrange. There was something about her bearing that commanded respect without demanding it, a quality that reminded them of the best teachers they had known in civilian life. "She doesn't look like any shooting instructor I've ever seen," David whispered to his companions, his analytical mind already trying to categorize this new variable in their training equation. Maria studied the woman's movements as she walked the firing line, noting how she seemed to take in every detail of the range setup with quick, efficient glances. "She moves like someone who knows exactly what she's doing, even if we don't know what that is yet." Jake was reminded of his grandmother, who had been one of the finest seamstresses in their small Montana town. There was the same kind of quiet mastery in Elena's demeanor, the confidence that came from years of practice and refinement. "My grandma used to say you could tell a master craftsman by how they held their tools. This lady has that same quality, even though we haven't seen her touch a rifle yet." Rodriguez approached the three trainees, Elena walking beside him with measured steps. Up close, they could see that her hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of detailed work, though not necessarily the kind associated with military service. Her eyes were sharp and observant, missing nothing as she studied each of the young soldiers. "This is Elena Vasquez," Rodriguez said by way of introduction. "Elena, meet Private Thompson, Private Santos, and Private Kim. These are the three I was telling you about." Elena nodded to each of them in turn, her gaze lingering as she seemed to take the measure of each soldier. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that suggested Spanish was her first language, but her English was precise and clear. "Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you've been having some challenges with accuracy," she said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Before we go any further, I want you to understand something important. I'm not here to teach you military shooting techniques. Your instructors have already done that, and they've done it well. I'm here for something different." The three exchanged glances, unsure what to make of this statement. Everything about their training so far had focused on military techniques, precision protocols, and standard operating procedures. The idea of learning something different was both intriguing and concerning. "What I'm going to share with you comes from a very different world," Elena continued, settling onto a nearby bench and motioning for them to join her. "For 30 years, I worked as a seamstress in a factory that made precision uniforms for airline pilots. Every stitch had to be perfect, every measurement exact. A single mistake could ruin an entire garment. And in a factory setting, mistakes cost money and jobs." David's forehead creased as he tried to understand the connection between sewing and marksmanship. His programmer's mind looked for logical links between disparate concepts, but this seemed like an unusual analogy at best. Elena noticed his confusion and smiled. "You're wondering what sewing has to do with shooting, aren't you? That's exactly the right question to ask. The connection isn't obvious, but it's more important than you might think." She reached into a small bag she had brought with her and pulled out several items that seemed completely out of place on a military rifle range. There was a piece of fine fabric, a needle, several different types of thread, and a small magnifying glass. In precision sewing, especially the kind required for airline uniforms, every element has to work in perfect harmony, she explained, threading the needle with practiced ease. The tension in the thread, the speed of the stitch, the pressure of the foot, even the way you breathe while working. If any one element is out of balance, the entire piece suffers. Jake watched as Elena demonstrated a few stitches on the fabric, her movements fluid and controlled. There was something mesmerizing about the way she worked, each motion economical and purposeful. I'm starting to see what you mean. It's like how everything has to come together for a good shot. Position, breathing, trigger control, sight picture. Exactly, Elena said, setting down her sewing. But here's where most people miss the real lesson. In sewing, you don't think about each individual element while you're working. You don't consciously control your breathing or focus on the exact pressure of your fingers or monitor the tension in your shoulders. You integrate all these elements into a single, flowing process. Maria felt a spark of recognition. Are you saying we're thinking too much about the individual pieces instead of putting them together naturally? That's part of it, Elena agreed. But there's something even more fundamental that I learned in my 30 years of precision work. The most important skill isn't technical knowledge or physical coordination. It's the ability to maintain calm focus under pressure, especially when your livelihood depends on every single stitch being perfect. She looked at each of the 3 soldiers with knowing eyes. Sergeant Rodriguez told me about your situation. 3 weeks of training, solid fundamentals, perfect equipment, but consistent misses. He also told me about the pressure you're under, the doubts creeping in, the way each miss makes the next shot harder. The accuracy of her assessment was uncomfortable. All 3 had felt the mounting pressure with each failed qualification, the way their confidence eroded with every missed shot. It had become a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break. In the factory where I worked, Elena continued, we had a saying, perfection is the enemy of excellence. Workers who tried to make every stitch absolutely perfect often ended up making more mistakes than those who focused on consistent, quality work. The pressure to be perfect created tension, and tension created errors. Rodriguez, who had been listening quietly, nodded in understanding. I've seen this before, but never quite put it together the way you're describing it. These 3 know their stuff backward and forward, but they're pressing too hard. Elena stood and walked over to the rifle rack, selecting one of the standard training weapons. She handled it with obvious familiarity, checking the action and safety procedures with automatic precision. This isn't the first time I've worked with soldiers who were struggling with accuracy. Your situation is more common than you might think. You've done this before? Jake asked, surprised. Helped military marksmen. Not officially, Elena replied, adjusting the rifle's sling. But over the years, I've worked with several veterans who were dealing with similar issues. Some were returning from combat and couldn't seem to hit anything on the range. Others were like you, technically proficient but unable to perform when it mattered. The common thread was always the same. They were fighting themselves as much as they were fighting the target. She shouldered the rifle and looked downrange toward the 600-meter targets, her stance relaxed and natural. The techniques I learned in precision manufacturing, maintaining focus under pressure, finding rhythm in repetitive tasks, staying calm when mistakes have consequences, these translate directly to marksmanship. David pulled out his ever-present notebook, ready to record whatever wisdom Elena was about to share. She noticed his action and shook her head gently. Put that away, she said kindly but firmly. The first lesson is learning to trust your training without overthinking it. I can see from your notes that you understand the science perfectly. Now you need to learn the art. With obvious reluctance, David closed his notebook and put it aside. For 3 weeks, his analytical approach had been his primary coping mechanism for dealing with failure. The idea of abandoning it felt like giving up his main tool for understanding the problem. Elena settled into a shooting position behind the rifle, her movements economical and unhurried. Watch how I approach this shot, she said, but don't focus on the technical aspects. You already know those. Instead, watch my breathing, my overall tension level, the rhythm of my movements." The three soldiers positioned themselves to observe as Elena prepared for her shot. She seemed to settle into the position like she was sitting down to familiar work, adjusting her body with small, natural movements until everything felt comfortable. Her breathing was steady but not forced, and there was no visible tension in her shoulders or grip. "In sewing," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the range, "you develop what we called thread sense. It's the ability to feel when everything is in harmony, when the machine, the fabric, and your hands are all working together perfectly. Shooting has something similar." She acquired the target through her scope with smooth, practiced movements. There was no hurried adjustment or second guessing, just the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Her finger found the trigger naturally, and she fired without fanfare. Downrange, the spotting scope confirmed a center hit on the 600-meter target. "The shot itself is just the final step in a process," Elena explained, cycling the bolt and chambering another round. "Everything that happens before you pull the trigger determines whether you'll hit or miss. The actual trigger pull is just the culmination of all that preparation." She fired again, and again the result was a clean hit. Without pausing, she engaged the 800-meter target with the same calm efficiency, scoring another center hit. The demonstration was impressive not for its technical complexity, but for its simplicity and consistency. "Now," Elena said, stepping away from the rifle and motioning for Jake to take her place, "you're going to try something different. Instead of thinking about all the things you need to do correctly, I want you to focus on just one thing: feeling comfortable behind the rifle." Jake approached the shooting position with his usual careful attention to detail, but Elena stopped him before he could begin his normal setup routine. "Forget everything you've learned about the perfect shooting position," she said, her words causing both Jake and Sergeant Rodriguez to look at her in surprise. "I want you to get behind that rifle and arrange yourself however feels most natural and comfortable. Pretend you're settling in for a long conversation with an old friend." The instruction went against everything Jake had been taught about proper shooting form. Military marksmanship emphasized specific body positions, exact sight pictures, and standardized procedures. The idea of ignoring all that training felt wrong, almost rebellious. "Trust me on this," Elena said, sensing his hesitation. "You can return to your military techniques later. Right now, we're going to explore a different approach." Jake settled behind the rifle, consciously trying to ignore the voice in his head that cataloged all the ways his position deviated from textbook form. Instead of the rigid military shooting stance he had practiced for weeks, he found a position that simply felt comfortable and sustainable. "Good," Elena said, observing his more relaxed approach. "Now, instead of thinking about sight alignment and trigger control, I want you to have a conversation with that target. Look through your scope and really see the target, not as an object you need to hit, but as something you're getting to know." The instructions seemed almost mystical, but Jake tried to follow it anyway. Through his scope, the distant target resolved into a clear, familiar shape. Instead of seeing it as a pass-or-fail test of his marksmanship skills, he tried to simply observe it and understand its relationship to his position. "In precision sewing," Elena continued, her voice taking on the quality of a meditation guide, "we learn to feel the fabric, to understand its texture and tension. The fabric would tell us how to work with it, rather than us forcing our will upon it. The same principle applies here." Jake found himself settling into a rhythm that felt different from his previous attempts. His breathing became natural rather than forced, and his grip on the rifle relaxed into something that felt sustainable rather than precisely controlled. The target in his scope seemed clearer, more defined. "When you're ready," Elena said quietly, "take the shot. But don't think of it as shooting at the target. Think of it as completing a conversation that you've been having through the scope." The instruction was unlike anything Jake had heard in 3 weeks of military training. But something about Elena's calm confidence made him trust the process. He felt his finger find the trigger naturally, without the conscious effort he usually applied to trigger control. The rifle fired almost as a surprise, the shot breaking cleanly without the anticipation and tension that had characterized his previous attempts. Downrange, the spotting scope revealed a hit just outside the center ring of the 600-meter target. "Outstanding," Elena said, her approval evident in her voice. "That's the first time I've seen you shoot without fighting yourself. How did that feel different from your previous attempts?" Jake remained behind the rifle, processing what had just happened. "It felt easier, like I wasn't trying so hard to control everything. The shot just happened when it was ready to happen." "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "You stopped trying to force a perfect shot and allowed a good shot to develop naturally. That's the difference between mechanical precision and organic accuracy." Maria stepped forward eagerly, ready to try this new approach. Her previous attempts had been characterized by intense focus and conscious control of every variable she could identify. The idea of relaxing that control was both appealing and frightening. Elena guided her through the same process, encouraging her to find comfort rather than precision, to develop a relationship with the target rather than trying to dominate it. Maria's natural steadiness, which had been compromised by overthinking, began to reassert itself as she relaxed into the shooting position. "In my factory work," Elena shared as Maria prepared for her shot, "I learned that the women who lasted longest and produced the highest quality work were those who found their own rhythm rather than trying to match someone else's pace. Everyone has a natural timing that produces their best work." Maria found herself breathing more naturally as she acquired the target, her movements flowing instead of being mechanically controlled. The shot broke cleanly, resulting in her first hit in 3 weeks of training. David's turn came with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. His analytical mind struggled with the seemingly unscientific approach Elena advocated, but the evidence of Jake's and Maria's success was impossible to ignore. "This is going to be especially challenging for you," Elena said, recognizing the internal conflict playing out in David's expression. "Your analytical nature is both your greatest strength and your biggest obstacle right now. You understand the science perfectly, but you're letting that knowledge interfere with the art." She guided David through the same process, encouraging him to set aside his calculations and trust his body's natural ability to coordinate the complex task of accurate shooting. It was a difficult transition for someone who had spent 3 weeks trying to solve their shooting problems through data analysis and mathematical precision. "In manufacturing," Elena explained as David struggled to quiet his analytical mind, "we had engineers who could design perfect stitching patterns on paper, but the best seamstresses were often women who had never studied engineering. They understood the work through their hands and their experience, not through calculations." David's shot came as a surprise to him, breaking cleanly while he was still trying to process Elena's philosophical approach to marksmanship. The result was a solid hit, closer to center than either Jake's or Maria's attempts. "How is this possible?" David asked, his scientific worldview challenged by the success of what seemed like an unscientific approach. "Everything I know about ballistics says that precision comes from controlling variables, not from relaxing control." Elena smiled at his confusion, recognizing the struggle between intellectual understanding and intuitive performance. "You're not abandoning precision," she explained. "You're integrating it so completely that it becomes unconscious. The variables you've been calculating are still there, but now your body is processing them naturally instead of your conscious mind trying to control each one individually." Rodriguez, who had been observing the session with growing amazement, stepped forward to examine the targets through the spotting scope. 3 hits after weeks of consistent misses represented a breakthrough that went beyond simple technique adjustment. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying both gratitude and curiosity, I've never seen anything quite like this. How did you develop this approach? Necessity, Elena replied simply. In precision manufacturing, you learn that the human element is both the most variable and the most adaptable part of any system. We had to find ways to help workers perform consistently under pressure, day after day, year after year. The techniques that worked in the factory translate to any activity that requires precise coordination under stress. The remainder of the morning was spent reinforcing the new approach, with each trainee taking multiple shots at various distances. The improvement was dramatic and consistent. While not every shot was a bullseye, the random misses that had characterized their previous 3 weeks were replaced by predictable, manageable accuracy. The key insight, Elena explained as they broke for lunch, is understanding the difference between conscious competence and unconscious competence. Right now, you're all consciously competent. You know what to do and can do it when you think about it carefully. But true mastery comes when these skills become unconscious, when your body knows what to do without your mind having to control every detail. Jake found himself thinking about his hunting experiences back home, recognizing now that his best shots had always come when he wasn't thinking about technique. The deer he had dropped at long range in Montana had fallen to shots that felt natural and inevitable, not to carefully calculated attempts at precision. Maria reflected on her journey from the streets of East Los Angeles to the rifle ranges of Fort Benning, understanding now that her initial struggles had come from trying too hard to prove herself worthy of being there. Elena's approach had given her permission to trust her natural abilities rather than constantly second-guessing herself. David's analytical mind was still processing the morning's revelations, trying to understand how abandoning conscious control could lead to better results. But the evidence was undeniable. His shots had been more accurate when he stopped calculating and started trusting. The afternoon session would test whether the morning's breakthrough was sustainable and whether the 3 struggling soldiers could build upon their newfound success. Elena had given them a new framework for approaching marksmanship, but the real test would be whether they could integrate these lessons into consistent performance. As they prepared to return to the range after lunch, all 3 felt a cautious optimism that had been absent for weeks. They had finally hit their targets, but more importantly, they had discovered a new way of thinking about the challenge they faced. The afternoon would reveal whether Elena's unconventional wisdom could transform 3 weeks of failure into the foundation for long-term success. The Georgia sun climbed higher as the 4 figures made their way back to the firing line, ready to test whether the morning's breakthrough represented a temporary anomaly or the beginning of a genuine transformation in their approach to precision marksmanship. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Elena led Jake, Maria, and David through increasingly challenging shooting scenarios. Word of the morning's breakthrough had spread among the other trainees and instructors, creating an audience that added another layer of pressure to an already intense situation. Now we find out if this morning was just beginner's luck or something more substantial, Elena said, her voice carrying both encouragement and challenge. Pressure has a way of revealing whether you've truly internalized a new skill or just temporarily accessed it. The afternoon's first test involved shooting from improvised positions, rather than the controlled prone stances they had used in the morning. Elena had them shooting from sitting positions, standing against barriers, and even from awkward angles that simulated real-world combat conditions. Jake approached the first position with the same relaxed confidence he had discovered that morning. But the unfamiliar stance immediately triggered his old habits of overthinking and mechanical precision. His first shot missed completely, sending him back into the spiral of self-doubt that had plagued him for 3 weeks. "Stop," Elena commanded before he could chamber another round. "What just happened in your mind between settling into position and pulling the trigger?" Jake paused, reflecting on the last few moments. "I started thinking about how this position was different from this morning," about how I needed to adjust my technique to compensate for the new angle. I guess I went back to trying to control everything manually. Elena nodded knowingly. This is exactly why I wanted to test you under different conditions. The goal isn't to learn one perfect technique, but to develop the ability to find your natural shooting rhythm regardless of the circumstances. She guided Jake through the same centering process they had used that morning, but adapted for the new shooting position. Instead of trying to force the improvised stance into a textbook form, she encouraged him to find stability and comfort within the constraints of the position. In precision sewing, Elena explained, as Jake settled into a more natural version of the sitting position, we often had to work on garments that were partially completed, in awkward orientations, or under time pressure. The workers who succeeded were those who could maintain their core principles while adapting to changing conditions. Jake's second attempt from the sitting position resulted in a solid hit, demonstrating that the morning's lessons could indeed translate to different circumstances. But the real test would be whether Maria and David could make the same adaptation. Maria approached her turn with determination, but Elena stopped her before she could even settle into the shooting position. I can see the tension building in your shoulders already, Elena observed. You're preparing to fight this position instead of working with it. Take a moment to simply stand here and breathe. Look at the target and remember that it's not your enemy. The instruction seemed simple, but Maria realized she had indeed been approaching the shooting position like a battle to be won rather than a task to be accomplished. Elena's reminder helped her return to the mindset that had produced her morning success. One of the most important lessons from manufacturing, Elena continued, was learning to work with the material rather than against it. Fabric has its own characteristics and tendencies. You can fight against those qualities and create tension and imperfections, or you can understand them and use them to your advantage. Maria found her natural point of aim more quickly than she had expected, allowing the improvised sitting position to feel stable rather than awkward. Her shot resulted in another hit, building confidence in the adaptability of Elena's approach. David's analytical mind was working overtime as he observed his friend's successes and failures with the new shooting positions. He could see the pattern. When they trusted Elena's process, they succeeded. But when they reverted to overthinking, they struggled. You're analyzing them instead of preparing yourself, Elena said, noting David's intense observation of the others. This is your greatest strength and weakness rolled into one. Your ability to understand systems and patterns is valuable, but right now it's keeping you outside the experience instead of immersed in it. David recognized the truth in her assessment. Throughout his civilian career as a programmer, he had been most effective when he could step back and analyze problems objectively. But shooting seemed to require a different kind of engagement, one that his analytical nature resisted. In precision work, Elena shared as David prepared for his turn, we learned that there's a time for analysis and a time for execution. The best seamstresses could switch between these modes fluidly. When a problem arose, they could step back and analyze it systematically. But when the work was flowing smoothly, they trusted their hands and their experience. David's challenge was learning to recognize when to engage his analytical mind and when to set it aside. His shot from the improvised position was his most difficult yet, requiring several attempts before he could quiet his mental calculations enough to trust his body's natural coordination. As the afternoon progressed, Elena introduced increasingly complex scenarios that tested not just their shooting skills, but their ability to maintain the centered focus she had taught them under mounting pressure. Time limits, multiple targets, and unpredictable conditions all conspired to push the three trainees back toward their old patterns of overthinking and forcing precision. This is the real test, Elena explained, as she set up a scenario involving multiple targets at different ranges with a strict time limit. Anyone can hit a target when they have unlimited time and perfect conditions. The measure of true competence is performance under pressure. The scenario required each shooter to engage 3 targets at 400, 600, and 800 meters within a 2-minute time frame. It was exactly the kind of pressure situation that had consistently defeated them during their previous 3 weeks of training. Jake went first, and Elena could see the familiar tension beginning to build in his posture as he contemplated the challenge ahead. Before he could settle into the shooting position, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember the conversation we had this morning about perfection being the enemy of excellence?" she asked. "This exercise isn't about achieving perfect scores. It's about maintaining your natural shooting rhythm even when external pressure is trying to disrupt it." Jake nodded, taking a deep breath and consciously releasing the tension that had been building. He approached the first target with the same conversational mindset Elena had taught him, acquiring and engaging it smoothly before moving to the longer ranges. The time pressure created urgency, but Jake found that Elena's approach actually worked better under stress than the mechanical precision he had previously attempted. His natural movements were faster than his forced technical procedures, and his instinctive target acquisition was more efficient than his calculated sight pictures. He completed the course successfully, hitting all 3 targets within the time limit. More importantly, he had maintained the centered focus that Elena advocated throughout the entire sequence. Maria's turn brought its own challenges. The time pressure activated her competitive instincts, which had served her well in other areas of military training, but could be counterproductive in precision shooting. Elena helped her channel that competitive drive into sustained focus rather than rushed urgency. "Competition isn't about moving faster," Elena counseled. "It's about maintaining your best performance when others are watching and when the stakes are high. The seamstresses who won our factory competitions weren't necessarily the fastest, but they were the most consistent under pressure." Maria found her rhythm quickly, moving through the target sequence with smooth efficiency. Her shots were solid hits, demonstrating that Elena's principles could indeed withstand the pressure of timed performance. David approached his turn with visible anxiety. The combination of time pressure and multiple variables triggered every analytical instinct he possessed, threatening to return him to the overthinking that had plagued his previous attempts. "I want you to try something different," Elena said, recognizing his mental state. "Instead of trying to calculate the optimal approach to this sequence, I want you to trust that your body already knows what to do. Your 3 weeks of training haven't disappeared. They've just been buried under too much conscious control." David's attempt was a struggle between his natural analytical tendencies and Elena's teachings about unconscious competence. He successfully engaged the first target, but began to overthink his approach to the longer ranges, causing delays that threatened to exceed the time limit. "Stop calculating and start flowing," Elena called out, her voice cutting through his mental chatter. "Trust your training and let it happen naturally." The reminder helped David return to the mindset that had produced his morning's success. He engaged the remaining targets with growing confidence, completing the sequence with seconds to spare. As the 3 trainees gathered around Elena for a debrief of the afternoon's exercises, their transformation from the struggling soldiers of that morning was remarkable. They had not only hit their targets consistently, but had done so under increasingly challenging conditions. "What you've accomplished today goes beyond simply improving your marksmanship," Elena explained. "You've learned to access a different kind of performance, one that integrates technical knowledge with natural ability. This is a skill that will serve you well beyond your sniper training." Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been observing the afternoon's progress with amazement, stepped forward to address the group. "In 8 years of instruction, I've never seen a turnaround like this. You 3 went from consistent misses to reliable hits in a single day." Jake raised his hand tentatively. "Elena, I understand what happened today, but I'm worried about tomorrow. What if we lose this feeling? What if we go back to our old struggles?" Elena smiled at the practical concern. That's exactly the right question to ask. The feeling you discovered today isn't magic that can disappear overnight. It's a natural state that was always available to you. You just needed to learn how to access it consistently. She pulled out a small card and began writing on it. I'm going to give each of you a simple reminder that you can use whenever you feel yourself slipping back into overthinking. It's based on the core principle we've been working with all day. The card contained 3 simple phrases: breathe naturally, see clearly, trust completely. These aren't technical instructions, Elena explained. They're reminders to return to the state of centered focus that produces your best shooting. Whenever you feel tension building or your mind starting to race through calculations, use these phrases to return to your natural rhythm. Maria looked at the card thoughtfully. It seems almost too simple. After 3 weeks of struggling with complex techniques, the solution was to simplify rather than complicate. Complexity has its place, Elena replied. Your technical training is essential. It provides the foundation that makes natural shooting possible. But once that foundation is established, the goal is to trust it rather than constantly checking and adjusting it. David studied his card with the same intensity he had previously applied to ballistics calculations. So, this is about finding the balance between conscious knowledge and unconscious execution? Exactly, Elena confirmed. In manufacturing, we had a saying, learn it until you can forget it. The goal was to master techniques so thoroughly that they became automatic, freeing your conscious mind to focus on quality and adaptation rather than basic procedures. As the afternoon session concluded, Elena gathered the 3 trainees for a final exercise that would test their ability to maintain their newfound skills without her direct guidance. She set up a standard qualification course similar to the ones they had failed repeatedly during their first 3 weeks of training. This is your opportunity to prove to yourselves that today's breakthrough was real, she said. I want each of you to shoot this course exactly as you would have this morning, before I taught you anything new. Use the same equipment, the same positions, the same targets. The only difference should be your approach. The challenge was significant because it required them to demonstrate independence from Elena's constant coaching. They would need to maintain the centered focus she had taught them without her voice guiding them through each shot. Jake approached the qualification course with calm confidence, using Elena's reminder card to center himself before beginning. He moved through the sequence of targets at different ranges, maintaining the conversational mindset that had produced his earlier success. His final score was well above the passing threshold, with most shots clustering near the center of each target. Maria's performance was equally impressive. The competitive drive that had previously created tension now served to maintain her focus and intensity. She shot with the natural rhythm Elena had helped her discover, producing a score that would have been considered excellent even for an experienced marksman. David's analytical mind wanted to process and celebrate each successful shot, but he used Elena's techniques to maintain focus throughout the entire course. His final score was the highest of the 3, demonstrating that analytical thinking could coexist with natural shooting when properly integrated. Outstanding, Elena said as she reviewed their scores. You've proven that today's lessons weren't temporary assistance, but genuine learning that you can apply independently. Rodriguez stepped forward to shake Elena's hand, his gratitude evident. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done here. These 3 soldiers were on the verge of washing out of the program. Now they're shooting at a level that rivals some of our advanced students. Elena accepted the thanks graciously, but redirected credit to the trainees themselves. They had all the technical skills they needed from the beginning. I just helped them get out of their own way so those skills could function naturally. As the day ended and the group prepared to return to the barracks, Jake, Maria, and David reflected on the remarkable transformation they had undergone. 24 hours earlier, they had been struggling soldiers facing possible failure. Now they were confident marksmen with a new understanding of how to access their best performance. "The thing that amazes me most," Jake said as they walked back to their quarters, "is that we didn't learn any new shooting techniques today. We learned how to use the techniques we already knew." Maria nodded in agreement. "It's like Elena showed us that we were fighting ourselves instead of working with ourselves. Once we stopped that internal battle, everything else fell into place." David was still processing the implications of Elena's teaching methods. "I keep thinking about what she said about unconscious competence. My whole career has been built on conscious analysis and control, but today I learned that there's another way to perform complex tasks." The three friends spent their evening in the barracks consolidating their understanding of Elena's lessons. But without the desperate urgency that had characterized their previous study sessions. For the first time in 3 weeks, they felt confident about their prospects for completing sniper training successfully. Elena had left them with more than improved marksmanship skills. She had given them a new framework for approaching challenging tasks, a way of integrating technical knowledge with natural ability that would serve them well beyond their military careers. The next morning brought final qualification exercises that would determine whether they could advance to the next phase of sniper training. But unlike the anxiety-ridden anticipation of previous mornings, Jake, Maria, and David approached the new day with calm confidence. They had learned that sometimes the most profound solutions come from the most unexpected sources, and that wisdom about performance and precision could be found in experiences far removed from military training. A seamstress from a uniform factory had taught 3 struggling soldiers that excellence comes not from forcing perfection, but from trusting the natural integration of knowledge, skill, and focused intention. As they prepared for their final qualification attempts, all 3 carried Elena's reminder card and the deeper understanding that their best performance would come not from trying harder, but from trying smarter. They had discovered that the path to mastery often involves learning when to let go of conscious control and trust the unconscious competence that proper training develops. The young snipers who had missed repeatedly for 3 weeks had found their mark not by improving their technique, but by discovering how to access the abilities they had possessed all along. In learning to trust themselves, they had transformed from struggling trainees into confident marksmen ready to advance in their chosen field. Their story would become legend at Fort Benning, told to future classes of sniper trainees as an example of how breakthrough performance often comes from unexpected sources and unconventional wisdom. But for Jake, Maria, and David, it would remain a personal reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from learning when to stop trying so hard and start trusting what you already know.